More than 1 million migrants and refugees crossed into Europe in 2015, the mass migration sparking a crisis as countries struggle to cope with the influx and has created division in the EU as well over how to best deal with resettling these folks. I'm joined by our panel of experts today, Bill Rosenberg, Alain Sanders, Alena Shautsova, am I saying it nearly correct? Right. She's an immigration attorney. And joining us live via Skype from Turkey is Christy Delafield, a senior communications officer at Mercy Corps. Christy, I'll start with you since you're up in the monitor there. Tell me what your take is on the Syrian migration crisis right now, as you're right in the heart of it in Turkey.
Well, we here at Mercy Corps are seeing millions of innocent Syrian civilians that are just trying to survive this seemingly endless war. Mercy Corps is the largest NGO providing assistance to Syrians inside the country, food, blankets. We help about 500,000 people a month, and we're just seeing people.
Having a little trouble hearing you, but I understand you're helping about 500,000 people a month. Bill, from a historical perspective, are these numbers that we see going through Europe right now more or less unprecedented?
Yes, although the process is not unprecedented. One of the things I mentioned to your producers early on is that when I see what's going on now, I resonate back to the 1930s when the Jews were trying to get out of Europe. There was actually the famous situation of the St. Louis, a ship that was full of Jews that was trying to come to the United States. They weren't allowed to disembark, and ultimately they went back to Europe. Some of them survived the war, but many didn't. And the reason why we didn't let them off the boat was there was a fear of getting involved in sort of European entanglements and probably some degree of anti-Semitism for sure. The bottom line is that right now Europe has this confrontation of what do? And this is not a new situation because they've been having this before the Syrians were coming on board, because they had a number of guest workers who they did not provide sort of citizenship paths for them, and they created a permanent underclass as a result.
Alan, is there a solution here? I mean, these countries are being overwhelmed by people from another country, from a different culture, and as big-hearted as you want to be, the people who are already in those communities are having problems dealing with the influx. It's overcrowding schools in some areas, it's crowded parks, and the different cultural differences has created friction as well.
Sure, and there are many, and there's one additional issue. I mean, these are all issues that you correctly mentioned, but there's also the issue of terrorism. And I think one of the large reasons why many people are resisting this large influx in Europe is the fear that some terrorists may infiltrate with the refugees. There's also an added issue which nobody really wants to talk about too much, and that is that certainly the Arab states surrounding Syria are, and the Muslim states surrounding Syria are taking in the bulk of the refugees. I mean, we forget about that. But the ones that have the wealth, the Gulf states, are basically just doing nothing. And I think one of the things that diplomats need to take a look at is, what is Saudi Arabia doing? What is Iran doing? Everybody talks about the major players, but nobody talks about their responsibilities for the refugees that are being created. And it seems to me that at a peace conference, at an attempt to negotiate something for the cessation of hostilities, there should also be, since these people are also sitting at the table, the Saudis and the Iranians and the Russians, about what are they doing to take care of the civilians. Many people say it's a European problem. Well, it's not just a European problem. It's an Arab problem, and it's a Russian problem as well.
Yeah, it's a global problem, because in the United States we're going to be taking in some refugees as well. Alena, you deal one-on-one with these folks. Tell me what your take is on this migrant crisis.
Well, you know, the world faced the largest migrant crisis since World War II. About 60 million people being displaced or had to flee their countries. In Syria alone, 4 million people had to be were forced to go to Europe, and 12 million people had to be displaced internally. So naturally, immigration lawyers and the associations of attorneys in the United States have to respond to this. And we as nations of leaders, as I hope, we have to do something to put a plan in place as well. United States laws actually provide for quotas as to how many refugees we can take each year. And for fiscal year of 2016, it's going to be about 10,000 refugees from Syria and about 85,000 refugees
Which is
whole.
actually a very small number when you consider 1 million have poured into Europe, which is Western Europe, which is roughly the same size as the United States.
You are correct. And that's why certain groups are advocating to increase that number and enlarge it. For example, American Immigration Lawyers Association, I'm one of the members, that we're asking Congress to enlarge this number. However, as you're aware, it's a tough political climate, and there's a lot of resistance.
Okay, we'll talk to you in just a second. Let me turn back to Christy. Christy, you're approaching this from the humanitarian standpoint. Tell me what the need is on the ground right now for these folks who have been uprooted from their homes, their lives have been disrupted, and they find themselves on a path in many cases to nowhere.
Well, we at Mercy Corps are seeing tens of thousands of civilians who are just struggling to survive. They're desperately seeking a safe place and aren't able to find one. Even just this week, we at one of our aid distributions inside Syria, an airstrike hit very near the vicinity, and 2 people died and 20 were injured. These are people who we're their only source of food, and they come to us for help. The number of safe spaces for civilians in Syria is shrinking rapidly.
Bill, you alluded to this before, but one of the factors that the migrants face is bigotry and hatred and prejudice. And it seems like every time there has been an influx of people, whether it's Cuban refugees during the Mariella boat lift to the Syrian migrant crisis, that there's a uprising of prejudice against the folks who are coming into the country.
The Cuban situation is a little bit different because United States policy was welcoming of Cubans. You know, with as soon as you touch American beaches, you are immediately granted asylum.
But I think the story at that point was that Cuba was actually emptying out its prisons and sending its criminals over here.
That's true. Those were people that were critical of that process. Right. What I wanted to suggest, though, is that right now we're in a political environment, particularly with some of the Republican candidates, and most notably Donald Trump, who basically said he was going to let no Muslims into the country. Didn't matter whether they were Syrian refugees or not. And that actually resonated with a lot of Republican primary or caucus goers. So you have to realize that while President Obama might like to have a more open path and members of Congress, there's a significant percentage of the U.S. Leadership and population that wants nothing to do with this. So as a result, how are you going to move forward? You know, the president could issue executive orders, change various provisions, but it's going to be a really hard row for the U.S. government to change their policies in this environment.
And Alan, you talked about this a little bit as far as resettling some of these migrants back into the region from which they come. What about the proposal of creating safe zones within Syria? And what about the world getting together and trying to solve this problem with Syria?
Well, it may be a little too late to have safe zones. A lot of people were urging the Obama administration to create such zones, to have a no-fly zone, to have some sort of safe haven for the refugees that are fleeing the battle areas. But the Assad regime and, of course, the Russian backers and the Iranians are on the offensive, and they're getting more and more territory. So it may be a little too late to have a military response that would create safe zones. Understand that that's a major commitment. It's not just air power, but there may be need for some ground forces to secure such safe zones. So we may be reaching the point where that's not possible, and that will be one of the criticisms that is leveled against the Obama administration, has already been leveled. And if we can go back very briefly to the campaign, that's one of the weak points of the Democratic position. Tying for Hillary Clinton to tie herself to Obama works well on the social issues, but on the foreign issues, that may be a different story. And what to do about Syria is one of the weak points, I think, that Hillary Clinton has to argue and come up with a solution of some sort.
Alena, I want to ask you if you had any advice for someone in this country who has a family member who is trying to migrate to the United States or a safe zone in Europe. What is there a legal standpoint that these people should take when they're seeking refuge in a foreign nation?
Well, first of all, they have to try to find United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees organization where they are at, because this is the organization that vets refugees and interviews potential refugees first.
Are they one in every major city? Is there one in most countries?
Unfortunately, because of the war zone and civil war, I'm afraid they're not. You can't really find them to be that everywhere. But they maybe placing calls through to relatives in the United States. We will be able to locate the nearest location, to find the nearest location for these people. But that's the first step in immigration, legal immigration. They have to go to these places where the potential refugees are being interviewed, and then they're going to be placed through refugee resettlement programs with different countries, including United States, because that's how the refugees come to the United States. They're not jumping off the boat. It's not possible. Right. So there is a legal process with a lot of security measures taken in. So the opposition to this resettlement, I think they should know that any potential refugee has to pass 3 levels of checks with the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, Department of State, and those are not just random people who are not checked. Right. But that's a legal process how somebody can legally come to a different country.
Okay, and obviously the advice to folks who are trying to migrate: get your passport, get your birth certificate, get any documentation you can possibly gather to prove you are where you are from and that you actually are in risk. Let's turn to Christy once again. Tell me about the situation on the ground there in Turkey right now, Christy. What's it like?
On the ground in Turkey or in Syria?
Well, apparently Turkey has large encampments of Syrian refugees who eventually migrate elsewhere, correct? Tell me if that's my impression. Tell me if that's correct.
Yeah. Turkey's welcomed 2.5 million Syrian refugees. Many are in, as you say, camps along the border, but many are also in the community. They're living with other families. They're finding other places to shelter. And as we've seen in the past week, there are tens of thousands that are along the Turkish border hoping to come into Turkey and have a safe.
Okay, we're losing Christy there, so I'm going to cut her off. But as she said, they have 2.5 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, which is a tremendous number for one country.
One of the things I think we also have to recognize is that there's this reluctance, a lot of these countries to want to take in these refugees. One of the things we have to realize, though, is once they get to these new countries, if their life is significantly improved, they're never going to want to go back.
Right.
Okay, so the question is, what's the future of a country like Syria with 4 million people or more who have left? Okay, and I think that's one of the unanswered questions. So if we're really concerned about helping the people, part of the helping may be to let them be in their own country and be safe and secure. And right now that doesn't seem to be happening either by the United States government or by any other countries in the world. They're fleeing, but there's not going to be an easy way to think that these people are going to go back and start living again in Aleppo or some of these other places.
Hindsight's 2020, Alan. Should we not have allowed Bashar Assad to fall or nearly fall? Was trying to promote his demise a mistake, opening up the floodgates for ISIS?
Well, I think for a long time we didn't do anything, and it seems to me that that was the correct policy. Remember, this is an Arab problem, and building states and reconstructing societies is a dangerous and very expensive and usually not a very successful proposition. So I think the Obama administration did nothing, and that was probably the right thing to do. But at some point, when you got a terrorist organization like ISIS coming along and taking advantage of the vacuum that is created by what is essentially an internal civil war, then you have to pick sides, and you have to provide some military hardware and support. And I think where the administration failed was in not understanding where the tipping point was and changing its policy to one of support for the people and the groups that would be fighting ISIS as well as Mr. Assad. But the initial policy of doing nothing was the correct policy. We have this notion that we can fix every problem, and I don't think we can.
Okay. Christy, we're going to come back to you. I'm going to give you the final thought. What would you like folks at home to know about this crisis, and is there a way for people viewing to help and help out in that situation?
Well, We're always really grateful. We're always really grateful to those people who support us. Our Mercy Corps' work is supported by donations, and people can make a contribution by visiting mercycorps.org. But for Syria, what's really needed is a cessation of hostilities from all parties to the conflict. We need an end to the war, and we need it now.
Okay, Christy, well said. Thanks very much for your time. Bill Rosenberg, Alain Sanders, Alena, thank you as well. When we come back, we're going to lighten things up a little bit. We're going to talk about VD, Valentine's Day, and a look at love and relationships in 2016 after this.